In 1763, Great Britain owned the world. From the spices of India to the forests of America, it was the wealthiest empire since Rome. But behind the celebrations in London lay a terrifying secret. The British were broke. This is the story of the 7 Years' War, the conflict that made Britain a superpower, and the massive debt that would eventually tear it apart. Imagine a map of the world in 1754. It isn't the neat patchwork of nation-states we know today. It is a messy, blood-soaked canvas of overlapping empires. In London, the counting houses of the city are humming with the sound of gold. In the forests of the Ohio River Valley, the air smells of wet pine and gunpowder. A young, relatively unknown officer named George Washington has just fired a shot that will ignite a global conflagration. Historians often call this the 7 Years' War, but for the British Empire, it was something far more transformative. It was the moment Britain decided to double down on the world. It was a gamble of such staggering scale that it would invent the modern concept of winning and the modern concept of bankruptcy.
By the end of this conflict, Britain would be the most powerful empire since Rome. They would own the seas, the spices of India, and the heart of North America. But they would also be buried under a mountain of debt so high it would eventually trigger the American Revolution and crack the foundations of the very empire they had just built. This is the story of how Britain bought the world and realized too late they couldn't afford the payments. To understand how Britain won, you have to understand a boring word that makes for exciting history: credit. While the French monarchy relied on taxing their peasants into the dirt, the British had a secret weapon: the Bank of England. Because Britain had a stable parliament and a reliable way to pay back loans, they could borrow money at much lower interest rates than their rivals. In the mid-18th century, war was no longer just about who had the bravest knights. It was about who had the deepest pockets. Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder realized this. His strategy was simple: outspend them. He poured millions of pounds into the Prussian army to keep the French busy in Europe, while the British Royal Navy strangled French trade across the Atlantic. History remembers 1759 as the Annus Mirabilis, the Year of Miracles. In Canada, James Wolfe scales the cliffs of Quebec. In the Caribbean, sugar islands are seized, pouring liquid gold into British coffers. In India, the East India Company begins its pivot from a mere trading firm to a sovereign power. Every time a bell rang in London, it signaled another victory. The British public was intoxicated. They were winning everywhere. But back in the dim light of the Treasury, the ledgers were telling a different story. The war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. On paper, it was the greatest victory in British history. France was evicted from North America. Britain was now the undisputed master of the waves. But victory has a price tag. Before the war, the British national debt stood at roughly £72 million. By the end of the war, it had ballooned to over £130 million. To put that in perspective, the annual interest payments alone were more than half of the government's entire budget. Britain had won the world, but now they had to manage it. And managing an empire is infinitely more expensive than conquering one. They needed thousands of troops to garrison the new frontiers in America to prevent Indian uprisings. They needed more ships to patrol the new trade routes. The British taxpayer, already the most heavily taxed person in Europe, was at a breaking point. The government looked across the Atlantic and thought, "We've fought this war to protect the colonies. Isn't it time they paid their fair share?" This is where the breaking begins. When London passed the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, they weren't trying to be tyrants. In their minds, they were being fiscally responsible. They were trying to pay off the massive credit card bill they ran up winning the 7 Years' War. But for the American colonists, this was a breach of the rights of Englishmen.
The debt from the war that made Britain rich was now creating the political friction that would lead to the American Revolution. The irony is staggering. To win the 7 Years' War, Britain had nearly bankrupted itself. To pay off that debt, it alienated its most productive colonies. And when those colonies revolted, Britain had to borrow even more money to fight them. By the time the smoke cleared at Yorktown in 1781, Britain hadn't just lost the American colonies, their national debt had surged to £240 million. So, did the war break Britain? In the short term, yes, it shattered the First British Empire. It led to a period of soul-searching and financial crisis. But it also taught Britain a dangerous lesson. It taught them that an empire can run on debt as long as the trade keeps flowing. They pivoted. They moved their focus to India and the East. They doubled down on the Industrial Revolution to create the wealth needed to service their massive debts. The 7 Years' War created the blueprint for the 19th century British Empire, a global, interconnected machine of trade, debt, and naval power. It was a machine that generated unimaginable wealth, but it was always built on a hollow core of credit. The loss of the American colonies in 1783 should have been the end of the British story. To any contemporary observer, Britain was a bankrupt island with humiliated army. But the war that broke Britain had left behind a strange residual infrastructure, the global machine. Britain realized that while they had lost the land in America, they still controlled the system. They turned their gaze towards the Indian subcontinent. If the American colonies were a drain on the treasury, India was a fountain of liquid wealth. The East India Company, now effectively an arm of the British state, began to tax tens of millions of people in Bengal. This tribute didn't just pay for local administration, it fueled the interest payments on the massive debts back in London. Britain had learned a lethal lesson. Colonies shouldn't just be strategic, they must be profitable. This shift from settler colonialism in the West to extractive empire in the East allowed Britain to outrun its bankruptcy for another 100 years. As the 1800s dawned, Britain found itself in a paradoxical position. It was the most indebted nation in the history of the world, yet it was also the wealthiest. The debt from the 7 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars that followed acted like a giant pump. It forced the British government to keep the Royal Navy at peak strength to protect the trade routes that paid the debt. This, in turn, secured the raw materials, cotton from the south, silk from the east, that fed the Industrial Revolution. The smoke of the factories in Manchester was, in a very literal sense, the smoke of the war that made Britain rich. The massive capital required to build the world's first industrial economy came from the same banking systems and credit lines established to fight the French decades earlier. Britain hadn't just broken its old model of empire, it had accidentally built a new, more terrifyingly efficient one. But you can only outrun a debt for so long. The pattern established in the 1750s, the cycle of global warfare, massive borrowing, and imperial expansion, became a loop. Each war was bigger than the last. Each victory required more administration, more soldiers, and more debt. By the time the 20th century arrived, the bill finally, truly came due. In 1914 and 1939, the British Empire played the same game one last time. They outspent their rivals, they borrowed from anyone who would lend, they won the wars, but this time there were no more Indias to conquer to pay for it, there were no more frontiers to tax. In 1945, Britain sat at the victor's table once again, just as they had in 1763. They were rich in territory and rich in prestige, but they were, for the final time, broken. The debt to the United States was so vast that the British Empire, the greatest machine of wealth the world had ever seen, simply ceased to be a viable business. The empire that was forged in the fire of the 7 Years' War was extinguished not by a sword, but by a fountain pen. In 2006, Britain finally paid off the last of its World War II debt to the US and Canada, a debt whose lineage could be traced back to that first great gamble in the forests of the Ohio Valley. The story of the British Empire isn't just a story of kings and conquests, it is a cautionary tale about the gravity of money. Britain proved that you can use debt to conquer the world, but you cannot use the world to escape your debt. The war that made Britain rich created a superpower, but it also created the very mechanism of its own eventual collapse. Today, the grand buildings of London still stand as monuments to that era, but if you look closely at the stones, you can see the truth. They weren't built with gold, they were built with the promise of gold. And in the end, the world held them to that promise.